Hello everybody and welcome back to Ancient Philosophy. In this lesson we're going to be talking about Democritus, the next of our pre-Socratic philosophers. We're nearly coming to the end of the sort of era of pre-Socratic philosophy, and in this lesson we're going to focus specifically on one of the main aspects of Democritus's general philosophy in his positing of the atom. So, more so than Empedocles, somebody who we examined in the last lesson, Democritus is known for a vast amount of numerous different writings. So this is one of the things, again, that is quite interesting about Democritus, as also is interesting about Empedocles. He is known to be somebody who was a prolific writer, who had written quite a lot of works. And the problems with this is that since we're talking about ancient philosophy and we are talking about pre-Socratic ancient philosophy, all of these writings are actually now lost. So we do have a number of small fragments in terms of his actual source material, and then we obviously have the later writings of people like Plato and Aristotle who have spoken about and talked about the kind of beliefs and ideas that are referenced by Democritus. So, while he is known for, or at least he is supposed to be known for and spoken about as having a vast array of different writing that he had published, or by published we mean in the kind of ancient philosophy sense, we only have a couple of tiny bits remaining, and we have to really draw all of our understanding of Democritus from people like Plato and Aristotle. Now, the birth of Democritus is predicted to be around the date of 470 to 460 BC. We're not entirely sure exactly what year he was born, but we know that he was born on the Greek mainland between 470 and 460. And above all else, Democritus was actually what we would describe, in fact, as a scientist. So, again, as referencing here from the ancient philosophy, there was obviously quite a lot of conjunction in terms of the traditions of science and the traditions of philosophy. They kind of mixed together quite significantly to the point where they weren't separate disciplines for science and for philosophy, but he was a successful scientist, as one would describe. Now, Democritus's theories effectively predicted the entire tradition of chemistry and nuclear physics. So I'm making a very strong claim when I say this, but it is actually true. I'm making the claim that the prediction that was projected by Democritus's theories came into the world of chemistry and nuclear physics to the point where he essentially predicted the existence of the atom. Now, when we talk about positing the atom and the things that Democritus did in the actual presentation of creating a position for the atom, it should be noted that he didn't exactly posit the atom in the sense of the atom that we describe to this very day. We don't know the actual thought process of Democritus in his positing of the atom and the existence of the atom, but we do have a basic understanding as taken from Aristotle. So what Democritus did was almost go against the grain of those like, for example, Zeno, who from we know from a lesson or two ago, posited a number of different paradoxes that related to the concept of infinity. So he believed that if one were to take a piece of material and begin to break it up, there must be some point where the material itself that has been broken up is indivisible. Now this is of course contrasted with what Zeno believed with his paradoxes of motion, because Zeno's paradoxes of motion were aiming to try and prove that things cannot be in flux. But in order to prove that, he relied on this concept of infinity, the idea that, for example, with one of his paradoxes, you couldn't get from point A to point B, because every time you travel from point A to point B, you have to travel half the distance, and then you have to travel half of that distance, and etc., 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 ad infinitum. And the idea being that if there is an infinite amount of divisibility that is allowed when it comes to these kinds of measurements, whether it be space, whether it be time, or whether it be some kind of material, then in that regard, then there cannot be any kind of motion. That is what Zeno posited in his paradoxes of motion. But Democritus didn't believe in this kind of idea. He believed that if we were to break material up, there must be some point where we cannot continue to break the material up any further. There has to be an indivisible point. And essentially there cannot be the infinite division of a piece of material or a piece of space or a piece of time. And so he didn't believe that one could divide to infinity and be left with some material that does not have any quantity at all. So, because this would simply mean that we cannot divide by infinity. So the only conclusion, therefore, must be that there has to be some point where a material cannot be divided any further, and there can't be any kind of any more division. That is the most indivisible point of existence for that particular material. So there must be some smallest possible point whereby the object cannot be further split. And in order to link this to the sort of modern conception of the atom that we have in chemistry and physics, Democritus actually used the word for indivisible to explain these tiny objects. The Greek word for indivisible is atom, or atoms. And so therefore, in his theories of indivisibility to a certain degree in terms of points that can be divided, what Democritus did was posit the existence of the atom. He believed that these objects are too small to be detected by the senses, but he did also believe that there were different variations of these objects, and that these objects were timeless. So we do have a little bit of a breaking away from the actual scientific tradition that Democritus almost inspired with his beliefs, because in the first passage here, we note that he believed that they were too small to be detected by the senses. That is true. Of course, atoms aren't things that we can detect with the senses. He also believed that there were different variations of atoms. Again, this is true. There are lots of different variations of atoms, depending on the number of protons that exist in a nuclei. So you've got copper, nitrogen, gold, etc., etc., etc. But the thing that obviously isn't the case is that the objects are not timeless. There is not any kind of special relationship between the atom and time. And so, while it's a very rudimentary understanding of the modern science of the atom, it's a remarkable hypothesis for a pre-Socratic Greek philosopher to try and examine. And in terms of the prediction, essentially Democritus is right. They do exist small things that cannot be divided any further. Of course, now in modern nuclear physics, we note that we can actually split the atom. We can split the atom into its constituent parts, and we can split the nucleus of an atom into further subatomic particles as well. But of course, in the all the way up until the 20th century, before we could even posit the idea that we could even do that, before things like the Rutherford experiments, we believed in the existence of the atom, and the atom was something that was indivisible and, of course, had lots of different variations. So ultimately, like I said here, Democritus was essentially correct in his hypothesis, in at least the most fundamental parts of the hypothesis. The idea that there are things that can't be divided any further, that we can't just divide ad infinitum to when it comes to different things related to space and time and object and material and materialism, essentially. But of course, this is not a scientifically sophisticated theory in the sense that it would stand up to any kind of scrutiny to this day. So that's really where the majority of our understanding of Democritus's contributions to science and philosophy really sits. For the most part, we would talk about his contributions to the existence of the atom and the sort of contrast that he had with Zeno. But he did also come up with a number of other different theories as well, one related to the concept of modalities. So on top of the discovery of the atom, which I'm going to put in, I'm going to say in inverted quotes, because obviously this is a theory that was posited thousands of years before the actual discovery of the atom. But before this, Democritus also believed in what we would describe as a plurality of worlds, which is a very interesting hypothesis. He believed that these different worlds were of different sizes, and that these different worlds had contained within them different things. And of course, this would be a belief that we can actually replicate when we talk about the modern metaphysics of modality and modal realism, the belief that there exists different possible worlds, and that according to a strict interpretation of modal realism, one that or a Lewisian interpretation of modal realism, that these possible worlds actually are concrete realities that do exist. And Of course, again, it would be a mistake to suggest that the idea of the plurality of worlds presented by Democritus is in any way symbolic of this later modal metaphysical tradition. The idea that Democritus is talking about the philosophy of modality when he talks about the idea of there being a plurality of worlds. That's not what he's saying. That's not what he's doing. But he's positing the idea that there are different worlds of different contents and different sizes. And this would be a theory that would be picked up by the metaphysicians of modality in the future.